Hey, I'm Rajal, an engineer here at Thesys, and in this video, I'm going to show you how you can integrate C1 by Thesys alongside LangGraph in your project. Thesys has a guide on how to create a basic LangGraph agent using Python and the Thesys C1 API. Let's first quickly go through this documentation so that I can give you an overview of what exactly we need to do. Then, we can implement these steps in a project together. First, we list down the required dependencies. Next, we define the graph.py file, which contains most of our logic related to LangGraph. Let's take a look at this code to understand what it's doing. First, we define the agent state. Next, we initialize the model and bind tools to it. We also set the base URL to point to the Thesys C1 API and the API key to contain our Thesys API key. In the next step, we define a call model function, which is responsible for invoking this AI model. After that, we define the conditional logic related to when we need to call tools and when we need to end the conversation. Step 5, we build the graph using all of the nodes and edges that we just defined. Lastly, we create a memory saver to persist our conversation history, and then we compile all of this into an application. In the next step, we implement the thread service, which is responsible for handling thread metadata and message retrieval and updates to the UI. In the last step of our backend implementation, we define the main.py file, which contains our core chat streaming endpoint and other endpoints responsible for CRUD operations on the thread, such as creating or deleting a thread. This will use the thread service methods that we just defined in the previous step. That concludes our backend implementation. The front-end implementation is pretty straightforward. First, we import all of the methods responsible for calling the backend API endpoints that we defined. The Thesys Gen UI SDK exports a use thread list manager hook and a use thread manager hook, which lets you define logic related to how you want to manage your thread list and threads respectively. We pass the functions that we just imported to these hooks. Lastly, we pass the thread manager and the thread list manager that we created using the hooks to the C1 chat component. That's it. Let's jump into the implementation. We'll follow these steps to run the agent at the end of our implementation phase. I have an empty code editor open here. First, let's create an empty backend directory and initialize the front end with feet. Also, in the interest of time, I'll mostly just copy-paste code that we just read through. I have the example project, which contains the full code open here. You can find this in the Thesys examples repository. First, I'll copy over all the backend related code, starting with the requirements.txt file. This contains our backend dependencies. Next, I'll copy over graph.py, which contains most of our LangGraph related logic. Next, I'll copy over the thread service.py file, which contains our thread management related logic. Next, I'll copy over the tools.py file, which contains a dummy tool. In a realistic implementation, this might contain tools that extend agent capabilities by enabling it to perform some calculations or fetch external data. Lastly, I'll copy over the main.py file, which contains our API endpoints. I'll also update a couple of DTOs to accept the title field instead of the name field because the front-end client sends the title field instead. That's it for the backend implementation. Let's get started on the front end. First, I'll copy over the client.ts file, which contains functions that call our backend API endpoints. Next, I'll copy over the app.tsx file, which contains a use thread manager and use thread list manager hooks, as well as the core C1 chat component. This project has slightly different ESLint settings, so let's fix this linting error here. That's it for the implementation. Finally, let's run the agent. First, let's spin up our backend application. Referring back to the last section of the documentation, first, we need to install the required dependencies. I already have the Thesys API key set in my environment variables. You can first get this key from the Thesys console and set this through your environment variables or through a .env file. We can now run the fast API server. Let's also run our front-end application. We can now test our agent out, but as one final step, I'll modify the API base URL in our frontend client.ts file to point to our local backend application. Our agent, built with LangGraph and C1 by Thesys, is now fully functional. Hope that helps. Excited to see what you build with it.